Everybody, welcome to the last Sunday of 2020. Yeah, that should get a few rounds of applause, right? As we do look back at 2020, you know, it's interesting. Who knew last Christmas that we would be dealing with what we dealt with this past year, right? In December of 2019, we had no idea what 2020 had in store for us, and it was an interesting year to say the least. But as we look back at it, what you begin to realize as well is, aside from the pandemic and aside from a lot of the other things that we've dealt with over this past year, you know, life goes on pretty much the same on the side of it. You know what I mean? The pandemic just adds a whole nother level to it. I mean, when you look at your past Christmases over the years, you know, sometimes you have a great year. You look back at 2018 or 2017 or whatever it was. Hey, that was a great year, you know? 2018, maybe not that great, but not that bad either, right? And you get to 2020, you're like, yeah, this was not one of those best years, right? Not in my top 10 anyways. And maybe you're thinking, hey, 2020 was a horrible year. Because it may have been a horrible year. And we all have bad years, right? Where we feel like we just went through a lot. God was doing things in our lives. There was tests, there was trials, there was challenges, whatever it may be. And as I began to think about that, I really began to ponder it a little bit. You begin to recognize that, look, even if maybe nothing happened to you super horrible this year, you know people. There's friends, there's relatives. Maybe there's a next door neighbor. Maybe something has happened to somebody that you know of that gave you pause to realize how close it came to your home. Whatever it might have been. And as you look at it, you think maybe there was loss of life. Maybe you lost a friend. Maybe you lost a spouse. Maybe you lost a parent or a child. And as a result of that, you felt like you've been overcome with grief over 2020. Maybe there was a loss of finances, right? Maybe a job that you had no longer exists. Maybe that particular place will never come back. Maybe there was a business that you started that closed and you can no longer do it. Your income was reduced because of loss of hours. Maybe you lost a home. I mean, all of those things are realities with what we face in course of a year. Sometimes you think, okay, well, what about the death of a dream, right? Maybe something you worked your whole life to, like graduating college or getting a scholarship out of high school and going to college to play sports. And if you were a senior this year, that was tough. You'd worked your whole life for something to happen incredible in your life, and now that opportunity may have been gone forever. Who knows how it works out? Maybe none of those things happened to you. Maybe you just felt a constant oppression in your life over the course of 2020. Maybe you struggled with suicidal thoughts. Maybe depression seemed to creep in at different times. Maybe you felt isolated or alone. Maybe you were paralyzed by fear and you chose, I can't go out, I can't do this, I can't do that. Maybe you even made decisions based on fear that weren't good decisions. Maybe you were overwhelmed by anxiety and worry. What you think about as you hear that list, all of those things happen in a normal year to people. And the pandemic just adds another layer to it, right? Other things that we've dealt with, right? Whether it be the political spectrum we live in or the social unrest that we've had in this past year. No matter what you look at, everything seems to have been piled up into 2020, along with the normal things that we deal with on a yearly basis. And what was reminded to me was there were times in my life where I know that I had those types of years. Years that I was looking forward to. I can't wait to get out of this year and get to the next one, right? I remember when I was in college, some stuff happened, and it was a hard year for me because something I had worked for to play sports my whole life was taken from me in a moment's time. And it was like a decision that had to be made. It's like, I remember looking back at that was overwhelming to me. You know, that may not be overwhelming to somebody else, maybe that lost a loved one, but when you're that age and you're in the middle of something like that, it can be overwhelming. It can be something that you've had to give up, a death to a dream of some sort. I can fast forward to further on in my life where something happened in my marriage and we weren't sure it was going to work. I can fast forward to where something occurred in my job and that was a hard year for me. And I was under suspicion, and there was all these things going on that were untrue. And you know what? As a result of it, it was very difficult. I began to fight insecurity and maybe even depression. And then I can look forward to just recently when a loved one passed away. When my father-in-law passed, I went home to be with the Lord a couple years ago. All those years are tough years. Things that occur in a day-to-day life. And so when I look at those things, I can understand and I can tell you that I empathize with the fact that maybe you have heartbreak or despair. Maybe you've experienced devastation or distraughtness in your life. And all of that is true. And if that's where the sermon ended, we would all walk out of here miserable and horribly depressed. But the best part about it is that I really felt like God said, I want you to remind everybody that I'm still on the throne, that I'm still in charge of this world, that nothing has happened that caught me unaware or off guard. There is nothing that surprised God. He wasn't caught napping when the pandemic creeped in, right? He didn't just go, oh, wow, now what do I do? Right? That's not the God that we serve. In fact, the beauty of it is he knew it was coming before the foundations of the earth. He knew exactly when it was going to happen and what it was going to do and how it was going to affect us. And you think, well, then why did he let it happen? I don't know. Ask him when you get back to heaven. That's the only way you're ever going to figure that out. Maybe really figure it out. But what I will tell you is that God also uses things in our lives like that for a reason. He allows things like that in our lives for a reason. It may be a reason you never understand. It may be something you never comprehend until you get to heaven. But what you have to begin to recognize is that he is in control and he is still on the throne. There's 3 verses I want to read, and then I want to kind of talk about them because I really feel like the Lord gave them to me for a reason. The first one is Deuteronomy 31, verse 8. It says, the Lord himself goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed. Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 3 says, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Isaiah 55, verses 8 through 9 says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. As you look at those 3 verses and you start with Deuteronomy 31:8, what you begin to realize is the Lord is establishing a concept that whatever the circumstance, wherever you are in the life that you're living, he is always going to be with you. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. You will never be on your own. God does not lead you down a road and then tap out and go, okay, I'll see you in about 6 months and let me know how it works out for you. Now, you may choose to walk away from him. That's a different story. But he never leaves us. He never forsakes us. You get to Isaiah 43, and what happens is the Lord then gives us words of comfort. And it's basically saying what? No matter what, he will protect us. No matter what, he's going to keep us from becoming overwhelmed or overcome by whatever the trial is. No matter what, the trial will not destroy us because why? He's always with us. And as long as we keep him close, we will make it through. It doesn't mean we're going to make it out the way we want to make it out, or it isn't going to change us. It means we're going to make it through, right? He's always with us, and he will keep us from being destroyed. Then we get to Isaiah 55, and this is the one that maybe is kind of the hinge pin on this, because none of us really want to deal with 1 and 2, right? I mean, that's not a great idea when you start talking about trials. When you talk about Isaiah 55, he says this, my ways are not your ways. Meaning what? Hey, I assure you, says God, I'm in control and I know what I'm doing. And everything you're facing has been allowed by me for you to face. I love what my mom used to say. Whatever comes into your life has been sifted through God's hands before it gets to you. It's interesting, isn't it? That word picture stuck to me since I was a kid. So he's saying that we have to take him at his word. We have to trust him. We have to walk in faith and believe that even though we don't understand what's going on, even though we can't comprehend why God would allow whatever the circumstance is in your life, even though we can't comprehend it or understand it, we have to trust and believe that God is still in control and he still reigns and he is still on the throne. When you get into Hebrews chapter 11, you begin to reason. I'm going to just summarize a couple of thoughts that you can take out of Hebrews 11 as you get towards the end of the chapter. He makes it very clear that you don't always receive the promise. In fact, it says many died believing the promise. They didn't receive the promise, but they died believing it. There's many people that we know, loved ones or whatever, that we've prayed for, that we've asked God to heal and make sure that they stayed alive. And you know what? God still took them home at an age that maybe we didn't think was right. We don't understand it, but it's not for us to understand. There's a gentleman I used to work with at a couple of companies ago, and I'm not going to tell you his name because he might, on a risk he would be watching. I still don't know if he's really saved or not, but he was born and raised in a Catholic church, and we used to talk about the Lord, and we had differing opinions on some things. And one day, his niece died, very young, about 2 years old, crib death. Nobody quite sure why. The person that was watching them was his goddaughter, and it was just this huge family crisis for them. And he came to me in his office, and he was devastated because, it was just one of the nieces that he loved, and it was just a hard moment. And we were talking about it, and he had to give the eulogy, and he was preparing for it. And he came to me the day before, and he said, Scott, because I've been trying to get my head around the question, why? And I'm like, that's a tough one to wrestle with. He goes, yeah, I know, I really felt like, I just felt like God said to me, you know what, Gilbert, you can't ask that question because you'll never fully understand it. It isn't for you to understand why. It's for you to trust in me no matter what. It's for you to believe that I'm still the one that's in charge. And there sat a man in front of me, and I thought, my gosh, it's like when the centurion that didn't know God came and said, all you have to do is say the words. Here I was a believer my whole life, and I'm struggling with why it would happen to his niece. And he goes, I figured out, God just told me, Gilbert, it's not for you to question that. Don't even ask that question. I thought, wow, that's a good one for me to learn. Linda and I have a list of scriptures that we go through, that we declare and proclaim over different areas in our life as we walk through difficult times. And I just want to read one to you because it just struck me as apropos or appropriate for this message. It's found in Psalms 37, and it says this: keep trusting in the Lord and do what is right in his eyes. Fix your heart on the promises of God, and you will be secure, feasting on his faithfulness. Make God the utmost delight and pleasure of your life, and he will provide for you what you desire the most. Give God the right to direct your life, and as you trust him along the way, you will find he pulled it off perfectly. I love that verse. I love that term, feasting on his faithfulness. Because as you continually rehearse his faithfulness in your life, it gives you the ability to walk in faith. It gives the ability to stand in the midst of a trial and trust that God is who he says he is and that he's going to follow through. So a couple of examples I want to get to in the Old Testament. I want to start with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you're like, how does that fit in? Well, I'm not really sure yet. We're going to find out in a few minutes. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel was actually around in Daniel chapter 2 as well. In fact, he's really the primary person in Daniel chapter 2. These four young men were taken over as King Nebuchadnezzar took over the tribe of Judah in around 600 BC. And in doing so, Nebuchadnezzar went throughout the land and took all of the brightest and the best looking and the strongest and the smartest, and he kind of brought them in and began to do what I call a re-education camp. First thing he did is he took them and he took their Hebrew names and he changed them into a pagan name so that their names wouldn't remind them of Jehovah. And the names that he gave them were of pagan idols, they say. Then he took them and he said, okay, now we're going to re-educate you. We're going to make you learn the language. We're going to make you learn to read and write it. We're going to make you learn our traditions and our history. And we want you to be able to act and behave as a normal Chaldean, I believe. And in that 3 or 4 years that they were there, when King Nebuchadnezzar took over, the estimate was that they were somewhere between 13 and 14 years old. And by the time they had finished re-education camp, they were 17 to 18 years old. Gives a little different perspective on Daniel, doesn't it? As a young man, he went through some crazy things. And what happens here in chapter 2 is King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And when he has a dream, he goes to all the wisest and the brightest of his counselors, and he says, hey, listen, I need you to interpret a dream for me, but I don't just need you to interpret the dream. First, I want you to tell me the dream, and then I want you to interpret. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody came to me and said, hey, Scott, look, I need you to tell me the dream and interpret the dream, I'd be like, yeah, I'm in serious trouble. I would be on my face praying, right? Which is really what, you would have to do. I would be, I don't know. Maybe you would be okay with it. I'd be a little nervous. What happens is these wise men come back to the king and say, hey, listen, we need a little more time. And oh, by the way, just tell us the dream and then we'll interpret it for you. And he's like, no. If you can't tell me the dream, how can you interpret it? Because if I tell you the dream, you're basically going to make up lies and tell me lies to get me to believe something that isn't true. So if you can't do it, he says, I'm going to cut you into pieces and I'm going to turn your house into an ash heap. Now that's the Old Testament for you, right? You got to love that picture. So they can't, and they say, King, we can't do it. It's impossible. Nobody can do it. So what does he do? He declares, go out and kill all the wise men, cut them into pieces, turn their houses into ash heaps. Well, Daniel finds out about it, and so he says, hey, I want to have an audience with the king. So he goes before the king and he says, listen, just give me a little time and I think I can come back and I can give you the interpretation of the dream. So he goes and he prays and he grabs Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and he says, listen, we need to pray and ask God to speak to us, to give us grace and mercy in this and be able to answer the king's request. So they begin to pray, and sure enough, the Lord speaks to Daniel. He goes back to the king and he says, oh, king, I have an answer for you. He tells him his dream and he gives him the definition of what's happening and why, and he interprets it for him. And King Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face and says, clearly, Daniel, you serve the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings. And he praises the God of Israel. And what I find interesting about that is this. Here's a man that had just spent 3 years retraining them to believe something completely different. And when the king needed it most, what did they go back to? Their heritage. They went back to the God of Jehovah, right? They went back to the God of the children of Israel, Jehovah. They went back to the true God. They hadn't forgotten all the things that they had been taught when they were young. They had kept them close to their heart. Sure, they went through the re-education camp and they listened and they did what they did to get through it. But nothing had challenged them yet like what was about to happen. So as a result, King Nebuchadnezzar promotes Daniel. And Daniel says, hey, these 3 guys were just as much of a part of it as I was, and they get promoted as well. So now these 4 Jewish young men are high up in the governmental authority. What happens as we get to chapter 3 is this. King Nebuchadnezzar decides on a whim to build a huge statue. Now, he decides, some people say it was a statue of him, some say it was a statue of one of their gods. Either way, it's not a good sign, right? So he builds this huge statue out of gold. And then he decides he wants to have this humongous gathering as a dedication for this statue. So he calls everybody together. And we pick up there in verse 3. I want to read it to you because it's better written. And the first word it says, so the satraps. Now, I honestly can tell you I don't know what satraps meant. I had to look it up. It's basically kind of like a governor or a viceroy. But one of the words that I thought was interesting, it said somebody that could do things with no accountability. So in my mind, it sounded a little like the CIA or something like that, right? This is the guy that went out, it said henchman as well, right? So those are the guys that went out and kept the peace and did the things that nobody wanted to talk about. So anyways, the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So what happens at that moment in time? Everybody falls down except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Little side note, I always wondered where Daniel was. They say that Daniel was either so high up that when he didn't fall down, nobody was willing to report it. It's one of the ideas. The other one was that King Nebuchadnezzar had sent him as an emissary somewhere to do something and he was out of the country. The other one was that he just fell down. Well, I don't believe the third thought process. I'm thinking it's probably one of the two first ones. Because later on in chapter 6, you find him in the lion's den for doing exactly that, right? But what we know is that he wasn't around. So for whatever reason, it was just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What happens is some of his wise men that couldn't interpret the dream come to him and say, hey, we saw a couple of these guys that you put in charge, these Jewish young men, and they're not bowing down like your edict told them to, like your commandment said, O king. What are you going to do about it? Now, what's interesting is he didn't just say, hey, throw them in the fiery furnace like he had told people he was going to do. Instead, he gets angry, but he summons them to him. And as I was reading some of the thoughts about this, what happened here, it's interesting the words that were chosen by King Nebuchadnezzar. And the definitions in the English language are a little dicey, so they gave 2 or 3 examples, and it was this. That what he asks them was, is this true? Almost in disbelief. Or are you serious that you would really defy me? And the other one was like, was this intentional? Maybe you misunderstood. So what they said is that King Nebuchadnezzar was literally looking to give the 3 of them a second chance. That he couldn't understand or get his head around the fact how these 3 young men that he had re-educated and brought up wouldn't just bow down. What was the point of it all? That maybe there was a horrible mistake had been made. What I love about it is this. He says, hey, listen, if you bow down, then it's all good. I'll forget the first one, which again in that day and age was unheard of, right? If you messed around with the king and you disobeyed the first time, that was it. You were toast. So what happens when he says that? If you bow down, it's okay. If not, the fiery furnace. Pick that up in Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. It reads this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. You know what I love about that is that they didn't even hesitate. They didn't have to go back and pray and ask their God if it was okay. They didn't have to have a meeting and talk about it. It was absolutely no, we will not. And not only that, they were definitive. God can save us. God will save us. And then it was like, you know what? But if he doesn't, it doesn't matter. We're still not willing to bow. How do those 3 young men answer that way after being completely retrained and rethought and the whole 9 yards? They had, as I said earlier, they had kept themselves what? In the practice of what they'd been taught as young men. They continued to worship Yahweh, the God of the children of Israel. They continued to have those times of prayer, and they spoke to the Lord, and the Lord spoke to them. There was a strong relationship there, which immediately gave them that ability to say, no, we will not bow. We will not serve foreign idols. When I thought about their countenance and how they did what they did, it reminds me of a verse that I was given years ago, and it's Isaiah 50, verse 7, and it says this. Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore, I have set my face like a flint, and I know I will not be put to shame. That word there, flint, is a rock, right? And it's one of the hardest rocks around. And when they would strike another rock against it, and there was a lot of it in that region, when you would strike a rock against it, it would create a spark and you could start fire. When as you begin to look at the definition of that word flint, and it was a rock, the type of rock it was, when it's used in this passage, it's saying that I have set my face like a rock. I've hardened my decision. I have chosen that this is how I'll respond in whatever the circumstance, and I will not change it. Nothing was going to dissuade me or make me change my thought process or mind. And it's kind of like they came into this process saying, hey, look, no matter what happens, fellas, we cannot change what we know God has told us is right and wrong. That's how they were able to do it. It also reminded me of Job chapter 13, after Job had lost everything. And I believe it's his wife come to him and says, you know, you need to curse God and die. And Job says, yea, though he slay me, yet will I serve him. You see, neither one of them, Job or any of the 3 young men, were guaranteed that they were going to come out of it alive. If they had, they would have died believing the promise, as we talked about in Hebrews 11. But what we do know is that God was merciful and God saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you look at it, if you take a look at what we read about in one of the first verses I read, where it talks about Isaiah 43, where it says what? When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flames scorch you, for I am the Lord your God. That he had saved them. And so as they get in there, and I was supposed to read that later, sorry, is that when King Nebuchadnezzar goes ballistic when they say that to him. And what he ends up doing is, it says in the Word of God that his countenance or his face changed towards them because of their defiance. The people that throw them into the furnace perish because of the heat. And as a result, when King Nebuchadnezzar looks down inside of it, what does he see? He sees 4 people, not 3. Many believe it was an angel of the Lord. Many believe it was the pre-incarnate Christ. That's not a debate I want to have. I have no idea. I'll leave that to the smarter of you out there. You can tell me what you think. Either way, it's a messenger that comes and walks beside them in the furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar then calls them out. It says, hey, come out, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I love this. As they come out, they're no longer bound. And as he looks at them, not a single hair on their head, none of their clothing, none of their shoes, none of it has any char marks, none of it's scorched, none of it has nothing's burned, nothing. But the part that strikes me as the most amazing is that it says that they didn't even smell like smoke. Now, if you've ever been around a bonfire, even if you're not really in the bonfire or near the bonfire, you smell like smoke when you walk in the house, right? You may not smell it at the beach or wherever you're having the bonfire, but the minute you go somewhere else, man, you smell like a fire, right? When you have fire down the street, you could smell it. You smell like fire. What I love about that is it's kind of like a detail that most of us wouldn't even think about. But God wanted to make it so complete. He wanted to make sure that there was no remnant of the fire, not even a scent of the fire. I mean, it could have been easy to say, oh, let them smell like fire, no big deal, no harm, no foul, they still didn't burn. No, he wanted it to be completely impactless on their life. It did not do anything to them, didn't even infuse their clothing with the smell of smoke. And back in that day, they used a lot of strange, like oils and things like that, to get the fire going really hot. And so they had a lot of different pungent smells, it says. So it was even worse than that. Everybody else smelled like smoke, except for the 3 guys that were in the fire. I love that about God. I called that was God's exclamation point on, don't mess with my people. That story comes to an end, and the second story that I want to talk about, as I'm running out of time, the second story that I want to talk about briefly is I want to talk about the children of Israel. And it's a very familiar story and very familiar setup. The background is that God sends Moses and Aaron to free his people. And after 12 plagues, Pharaoh finally says, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. I can't take it anymore, go ahead and leave. Not only that, he sends them out with everything, right? Food, water, animals, riches, the whole 9 yards. They walk out with everything. They walk out richer than anybody else. The first place they end up is at the Red Sea. And what's interesting about it is it's actually in the opposite direction of where they were supposed to go. I guess if you really walk straight from where they were in captivity from Egypt to where they were going to the promised land, I think they say you can get there between 11 and 14 days. The problem is it was riddled with all sorts of places where people would want to attack and kill the Jewish people. So God in his wisdom said, I'm going to take them a different route. Not only that, God had a plan for Pharaoh for being so hardened a heart. God said, I'm going to use this to show my people my mercy. I'm going to use this to show my people that I can save them from an impossible situation. I'm going to use this to show my people that I am with them in an area where they feel like there is no option for us to survive this. So when they end up at the Red Sea, they're landlocked. There's land on each side that they can't get over. In front of them is the Red Sea, and what's behind them? Pharaoh's army, 600 chariots strong, people with them. And they've come to what? To take them all back to Egypt. And the first thing that happens is the children of Israel begin to complain. Why did you bring us here to die? What's interesting about it is that God is still sovereign and merciful in that moment in time. And he raises up the water, pushes it back, dries the land, and the children of Israel cross through on dry land, and it encapsulates the Egyptians, and they all die. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I'll just read it to you real quick. You don't have to turn there. It gives a really short synopsis. It says this, and this is, I love the fact it's entitled Old Testament Examples. It says, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Verse 5, but with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. You see, God provided everything they needed, but they complained at every turn. They grumbled at every turn, and they were absolutely unhappy with everything that was going on. What I think is interesting is that although God took them on a journey to the Red Sea and took them around about, if you look at one of the verses we read again, if you take a look at that verse in Isaiah 55, his ways are not our ways. Natural would have said, let's take shortest distance. God was like, no, I'm going to take you a different way. And that whole time, I'm going to be doing a work in your life. And that whole time, you're going to be learning from me. And that whole time, you're going to see my faithfulness. You're going to see me choosing to protect you and to guide you and to help you, even in the midst of what they consider an impossible situation. When they get to the land just outside the promised land, they camp. Moses decides we're going to send in 12 spies. This is the beginning of chapter 13, by the way, Numbers chapter 13. And he says, Lord, I want you to tell me, what's it like there? What kind of land is it? Is it good or bad? Is there towns? Is there walls? What's the soil like? I mean, he asks all sorts of questions. Spies are gone for 40 days, and they come back. And what happens? Everybody knows the story. All 12 of them are, we got it. We can go in there and take over the land, right? It's not what happens. It's the 80-20 rule. 80% of them are like, yeah, there's no chance, man. 10 of them are saying, we don't want anything to do with it, right? The other two are like, hey, listen, we got this. God has given this land to us. We need to go in now and take it. God is with us. But what do the people believe? They believe the 10 that are saying, hey, listen, we don't agree. Yes, it's the land of milk and honey, but these people are big. And oh, by the way, the descendants of Anak that are the giants, they're there. They look at us like grasshoppers, and we will not survive. We can't do this. And once again, they continue to complain against Moses and Aaron. And it gets to a point in Numbers chapter 14, when after they've come back and they've begun to contemplate it. And it says this. It says, so all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jehophni, who were among those who spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is exceedingly good. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. What's interesting about that is this, is it comes down to who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the voices of the majority? Or are you going to believe the word of God and what God has spoken to you? Are you going to believe that there's no way out, or are you going to trust the Lord? Are you going to look at it and say it's a possible situation, there's no way out? Or are you going to believe that God has a plan, that he will never leave you, that he's going to walk you through it? What's interesting about it is when they take over the land all those years later, what they found is the people inside of Canaan were living in terror for 38 years, waiting for them to come back. because they'd heard about what God had done for them when they destroyed, with the Red Sea, when they destroyed the Egyptians. The question that came to my mind is, how do we respond when facing impossible challenges? What report do we believe going forward? Whatever your year has been this year, I'm sure there's been difficulty. I'm sure you've experienced things that you never thought you would experience before. And my hope today is that as we begin to receive communion, and I'd ask that Don and Joe would come back up, as we begin to receive communion and we begin to look at what Christ did for us on the cross, there's a series of statements that are made about Jesus on the cross. And it talks about he was wounded for our transgressions, right? It talks about he is acquainted with our grief. And as we go through this and as we begin to look at what Christ did for us, maybe you've lived a life in fear, as we talked about. Maybe you've lived in depression. Maybe you've felt suicidal thoughts. Maybe a loved one has died. Maybe you're in a circumstance now that you don't think you can make it out of. Maybe you just don't understand it. My encouragement to you today is you don't have to understand it. That God is faithful. And that as you receive communion, begin to examine your life and say, God, I want to give this area to you. I don't want to operate out of fear. I don't want to have anxiety. I don't want depression in my life anymore. God is faithful to take those things from you. God is faithful to move in that area in your life. So I'm going to ask Don to come up and lead us through communion and close us out.